Well, this is traditionally the last day of summer. We know that summer will continue during the month of September. And it's been, for me, an enjoyable summer to come to you every week and to share the stories from out of the book of Genesis. Remember, way back at the beginning of summer, we started with creation. And we can have a variety of opinions here of how creation came into account, but I would propose to you, strongly propose to you, that the source of everything is God. Without God, we would have nothing. God has brought us in all of creation into existence. So from creation, we were introduced to Abraham. And then, you know what, this summer we spent 360 years together. Now, some of you might think, well, yeah, one of your sermons does seem like 360 years. But we talked about Abraham. And remember, Abraham, he had a couple drawbacks. And one of his drawbacks was that he was impatient with God. But secondly, he was elderly. I look across this room today, I don't think it's necessarily a drawback that we're chronologically challenged. In fact, I look at these school kits and I look at what you all do, and I think there's just power in being elderly, the wisdom. But in the midst of that, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, showed us how much God valued the work that the elderly could do, because in their 90s, Sarah gave birth to a son. Sarah gave birth to a son. That's a miracle. I don't think we're going to be announcing any coming babies in the congregation right now. But what a miracle that was. But Abraham got a little bit impatient because God told him that he would have a son and he would have a great nation that's founded under him. And he decided to have relationships with a woman and had a son named Ishmael. And that caused some complications. But once Isaac, his son, his natural-born son, came into the world, Isaac continues that lineage that is the great nation of Israel. And if you remember, Abraham was tested in his faith. He was tested in his faith because God asked him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And right at the last minute, because Abraham obeyed, and at the last minute, God did spare Isaac. We talked about how, in many ways, we have to, not physically, but sacrifice children. We do sacrifice children every day, and that's a tragedy. But we also give our children to God. I know many a person, many a couple who decide they're going to control their child and not give their child to God. And generally, the outcome is not that good. So Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. There was tension. They weren't perfect. In fact, Jacob was a turkey. He was a trickster. He was conniving. But God used him. And Jacob ended up having 12 sons. And if you look in the scriptures, he also had a daughter. But in that culture, they talk about the sons. I'm glad we're in a different culture now. But the 12 sons, one of his sons was Joseph, and Joseph had this tremendous ability to dream dreams, to see visions. But he also had the ability to brag about it, to aggravate his brothers, and get the favor of his father, and the brothers didn't care much for that. So these brothers, they together plotted against their brother. We still see today people plotting against the family of God, their own family. So they sell Joseph off into slavery in Egypt. It sounds like a bad thing, but we come to find out that Joseph goes to Egypt, and he uses those dreams and visions with Pharaoh, and he gets an important position in Egypt. Well, famine comes along, and in the midst of famine, the brothers have to go to Egypt and try to get food. Their dad sends them. And they don't realize it, but they're asking for food from their brother that they thought they had sold off. And he was now a great leader. Now we pick up today at the end of the book of Genesis. And by now, Jacob has died. And Joseph and the sons mourn the loss of Jacob, but the sons are uncomfortable because they think once now that dad is gone, that there'll be no longer any reason for Joseph to not retaliate against those brothers who betrayed him. So we pick up at the end of the book of Genesis. The brothers have learned that their father is dead, and they wonder what's going to happen next to them. It says this: when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins, the wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended to do good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Well, see, here, we hope by now you might have picked up in Genesis that God uses ordinary people like you and me, filled with our sins and our shortcomings and all those things. God uses us and people like them to face the challenges of life, to make a difference in this world. People with challenges are challenged by God to change the world. I said before, Abraham was elderly. He was impatient. He didn't want to wait. Jacob was a trickster. The sons of Jacob were conniving individuals that sold out their brother. We see all these folks who did things that were horrific. But God changed that evil into good. God can turn evil into good. You might as well write down your homework this week, because your homework week is this week is to review your life and to think about some moment that something happened evil, something happened that just wasn't right. And to look back and to see how God worked through that and made a difference in you in order for you to make a difference in the world. To use you in order to carry out his intentions in the world. And by the way, that word use, sometimes when we say you've been used, you think like, oh, somebody was unfair to you. When God uses you, God is offering you the privilege of carrying out his mission and ministry in the world. God used us to make sure that kids had school supplies. God used us and make sure that people who didn't have anything to eat yesterday ate. God uses us to give cookies to prisoners. That whole weekend, that Kairos weekend, that's a weekend when God uses imperfect people to reach out to people who are certainly imperfect, just like you and I, but find themselves in prison, and to share the love of Christ in ways maybe many of them had never experienced before. Now, one thing about all these imperfect people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all them, even though they made mistakes, even though they had flaws, even though they had shortcomings, for the most part, if you review all that in Genesis, they always were attuned with the voice of God. They listened to God. Every one of these characters, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, they listened. They listened. And because they listened, God was able to speak to them and use them. Think in your own life of all the challenges you've been through. We got tons of challenges in this room, present and past. In the midst of all that, again, kind of the same part of your homework, review how God has helped you through your challenges. Joseph was sold out by his family. Maybe a few of you even have been sold out by your family. Maybe not. He had every reason to gripe about the lot that he was given, sold into slavery, separated from his father, living in a strange world. In the midst of all that, Joseph could say, you know what? When I look at all this stuff that happened to me, I can see God in it. I can see God in it. We learned throughout these past weeks of the summer that it is God's intention for people to work toward reconciliation and forgiveness. Remember, we took a pause last week, if you were here, and we looked at what Jesus had to say about us working out our differences, about how we go to each other in private. And if that doesn't work, to get someone with some wisdom to go along with us, not to gang up, but to show us wisdom on how we might be able to work out our differences and finally to take things to the church. And we talked about last week about how important forgiveness was. Remember when I had you hold your arms like this for about a minute and said, doesn't that get old after a while? God intended us to live life like this and to be forgiving and kind. And in the midst of that, we talked about how, you go to your brother or sister in private, you take a few people, and then finally you take things to the church, and that does occur here. The folks who turn it upside down. And when I'm wronged, that I immediately go to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 of you and say, you know, I really got wrong today. You know what so-and-so did to me? And not even say anything to them. That causes tension. That causes major tension. And you know what? It doesn't solve anything. You end up hurting a person who could end up, once again, being your friend. God has intended for us to be instruments, even in our imperfectness, of reconciliation, in love, in peace. Well, I hope maybe throughout these past few weeks you have caught on to how imperfect you are and how imperfect I am too. We are all imperfect. But yet, every one of us in the eyes of God is beloved. Beloved. You say, you know, well, let's do this. I'm going to say you're imperfect, and your answer is going to be, I'm beloved. Okay, you're imperfect. That's right, that's right. That's how God sees you. That's why God sent his son, Jesus Christ, into the world. And the one writer that I look at his writings quite a bit and have to pick on Dennis always, because Dennis had him as a classmate in school. His name is Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen's a Catholic priest who was a great theologian of the 20th century, and Nouwen always talked about the importance of feeling you're beloved. And a reading I have from Nouwen this week said this. It said, think of the ocean. Think of the ocean. The ocean is the ocean is the ocean is the ocean, right? It's a body of water. But the ocean, by its nature, ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's rough, sometimes it's calm, sometimes it's downright treacherous. Think of yourself as the ocean. Sometimes you ebb and flow in life. But in the midst of that, you're still beloved. No matter where you are in life, you are beloved in the eyes of God. Let's do it once more. You are imperfect. Amen.